Welcome back to Sidewalk Skyline Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Rogers, and since January 1st, 2020, we've been moving around the country to explore faith at work in Canadian cities. I hope that you find our content inspiring as you discover just how many people there are in our urban centers doing some truly inspiring things. Hey, you can help us grow by going to Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcasts and leave us a review. Did you know that when you leave reviews on podcasts, that the algorithms work in such a way that it raises the visibility of that podcast in people's searches? And I don't know of too many podcasts in Canada that specifically focus on urban ministry. So you can help us increase that platform. It's my hope that as we do these podcasts, there will be listeners that will connect with our guests and maybe get inspired to engage in and support urban ministry in their cities. I know that for myself, my life was greatly moved and inspired by other Canadians doing gospel work in cities. And my generation of urban workers will eventually age out, and I pray that there will be many young men and women in Canada that catch the vision to do great things in their time. The cities need Jesus. Well, as we promised, we're bringing you part 2 of my interview with Dr. Anthony Hutchinson from Tyndale University, or Dr. Hutch, as some of his students call him. And he's quite a remarkable individual. If this is your first time listening, I'd suggest that you go back to the last episode, episode 9, and listen to part 1 of my interview with Tony. In fact, if you want to go back 2 episodes and catch the session with Olu Jegede, they are part of this chapter in the podcast we're doing called Gangland Preachers. Tony Hutchinson is literally in demand across the nation as a leading expert on gang psychology and intervention. Here's my conversation with him at the Mission Canada office in Mississauga.
Of high school, I was still being teased, I was still labeled.
Yeah, you're still carrying around a lot of rejection, right?
Yeah, and so basically what ended up happening, people still made fun of me for my glasses and the fact that I was not white, and racism continued at school. And so finally one day I was walking through a Canadian Tire, and they had a display case where they basically had a .22 handgun.
A 22.
22.
Yeah.
And it was there.
How old were you?
I would have been about 14.
About 14, okay. Yeah.
And I was able to steal it. And I took it to metalwork. I was in grade 9 at the time at Caribou High School, and I modified it
in shop class
to shoot rounds, to shoot bullets.
Wow.
And that was, and then eventually I got another one. And it was really funny because, the kids were making fun of me one day, and I remember some kid was making fun. I think at that point, again, drug dealing we started doing marijuana, drug dealing around that age, and and that's how you make money.
Yeah.
So I had to make money, and I was afraid of getting beaten up, people not taking me seriously, so the gun seemed to be an interesting way of protecting it. But I remember these kids were laughing at me.
Interesting conversation starter.
Yeah. And some kids were laughing at me, and I remember I just pulled out my gun, pointed at them, and they stopped laughing. And I realized that as long as I had this thing, I had power. And it got to the point where sometimes you have to use it to get a little bit of respect from somebody.
Yeah.
If you shot somebody and they died, it wasn't your fault, it was their fault. they shouldn't have teased you.
Yeah.
You didn't sit there and you reached the point where you weren't remorseful or sad about it. These people brought this on themselves. They shouldn't have disrespected you or something. But I guess at that point I was pretty angry about certain things in life. Even though my mom was healed, she didn't. Eventually, over time, my mom began to focus more on the healing than the healer. Mm-hmm. That was the thing about my mom.
Right.
That was a big problem with her. So I think we have a testimony, and we have to move beyond our testimony.
Right.
It's our testimonies are really there for God, not for us.
A sign of the kingdom is on the road of life.
Yeah.
But you don't say, okay, I'm going to live here at the sign. Mm-hmm. You follow the sign to where it's leading.
Yeah. And so again, it was just part of my mom's, I guess, one of her own Achilles heels. But by 14, I was getting in full-fledged, we can call it kind of gang activity, some bad kids. We were, now they call it a gang.
Yeah.
Back then, look, we were a bunch of kids. We stole stuff. We sold it. Yeah. We dealt drugs. We came from the same neighborhood, same high school.
Semi-organized crime.
Well, I had guns. If there was a Korean store, we could rob it.
Yeah.
It was fun. You point a gun at somebody and they listen to you. Mm-hmm. I get that kind of thing. And you think you're tough. You think you're cool. And we're doing a lot of really tough, cool, bad things.
Yeah.
But then I liked a girl in around Valentine's Day in grade 9, and I decided to go to a local Woolco and steal some nice presents for her. Mm-hmm. So I stole a Valentine's chocolate in a heart. I stole some CDs because music, and I stole a pair of girls' jeans. Mm-hmm. But now take into account, if you're a bad kid, you're dealing drugs, you're trying to vandalize cars, you're robbing stores, you're doing other. I got busted for shoplifting.
Nice.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, when they busted me, I had a pair of women's jeans or girls' jeans strapped around my waist. So it was just the antithesis of getting arrested for something so non-cool.
Yeah.
And I remember I
you had to maybe embellish the story when you told it.
Because you want to I was in a takedown or something.
Yeah,
but it wasn't that glorious, know. And anyway, to make a long story short, I ended up getting a probation officer, and he ended up being a Christian. And he was a real kind guy. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if probation officers are supposed to talk about Jesus and stuff, but this guy just started with me.
Yeah.
And so again, it's one of these things with God, with His signposts along my journey, right?
Yeah.
So I think so. Basically, it's basically God with His signposts along my journey, and so that was around 15. And so next thing I know, I got kicked out of the high school where I was at after getting arrested. And my mom, I had gone to a Christian school earlier in my life. And my mom decided she's going to put me back in this Christian school. So I ended up there for the rest of grade 10. And, grade 9. And at that point, I was pretty tough. I used to wear we had these fighting boots called Dayton's. They're black fighting motorcycle boots. And we'd walk around with our jean jackets and stuff. And I remember the first time I went back to the Christian high school, there was about 100 of us from grade 8 to 12 in Vancouver Christian High School. And I remember one of the first things I did after going back to this Christian school was picking a fight on the bus with some real tough guys from a school called Windermere, which was about 1,000 kids. But I was already pretty tough, and I thought I would fight. And you see, I think it was a day or two later, you basically see 800 kids from Windermere coming down, descending upon our little Christian school of 100 kids from 8 to 12 for a rumble.
Oh, man.
And I remember being...
You were an influence.
I was an influence. I remember being in the bathroom, wrapping up my hands to fight, putting on my fighting boots, getting my chains ready.
Yeah.
You know, in the Christian school, it's like, why did we let this kid in? And you know, and there was just a flood of cop cars that just descended. You know, I remember, I know our Christian principal and our Christian gym teacher and the school were all out there, and everybody's and they're waiting for me to come
Somehow
out.
turn the other cheek didn't really enter the equation at that
Well,
point.
it was pretty crazy, and you know, but you know what? One of the great, you know, I always say one of the greatest miracles in the world is when you get saved at maybe a young age and you just stay an amazing committed believer for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
That would be great. And the perfect plan of salvation is you come to faith in Jesus and a bus hits and kills you 5 minutes later.
Yeah.
Right? But you know, but the third greatest miracle is I ended up going to the Christian school in grade 9, causing this incredible debacle, and they allowed me to come back for grade 10.
That is a bit of a miracle, isn't it?
Right?
So then you ended up going to a youth group. How did that happen?
So at the Christian school, I ended up meeting this kid in my class, and now take into account I was still rebelling and being a rebellion. And one thing you do know about Christian schools, if we do know a lot of, there's some really bad kids in Christian schools.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, and so, and the thing about us is, if you thought that your kid's going to become better by going to the private Christian school,
Not necessarily.
you need to be worse than the secular kids just to prove you're bad.
Yeah.
Well, that was kind of the influence that happened with me. Mm-hmm. So I really went from bad to worse in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. But there was the kid in the Christian school, and his name was Dean Gurr, and he was a bodybuilder. He was always into bodybuilding, and he wasn't massive at that point, but he was still into it. And we were being shaped by shows like the A-Team and the Incredible Hulk and stuff like this. And he used to remind me of that. But you know, and again, him and I went going to the same school for grade 11 and 12. We went to a secular school after for those years, but he went to a church. I think it was called Vancouver Christian Life Center or something like that, in the West End of Vancouver. And the West End is one of the most densely populated areas in Canada. The most densely populated area in Canada is probably St. Jamestown in the heart of downtown Toronto.
Right.
One of the most densely populated, most of them diverse. But the West End was very densely populated in Vancouver. And Vancouver Christian Life was essentially there on Davie Street, if I'm not mistaken. And so Dean says, "Hey, you wanna you want?" I think at that time I still had one of my guns left. But I had hid it. And so Dean says, "Hey, you want to come to my church?" Because it was actually his mother and his aunt who were very devoutly Christian. There was a pastor there at the time. Rob Powell was the pastor.
I know Rob.
Yeah, and so they went to the youth group, and Dean said there's really good-looking girls. You know, so I was like 16 at the time, and you know that's a draw, you know, for a young rebellious kid, and so when I got
even a draw for meek and mild kids.
Yeah, and so we showed up there, and while we were there, I noticed the music. I always loved music. You know, I always loved music and television were things that raised me. And I remember the worship band was so phenomenal. And there was this guy playing guitar. The drummer was killer, and there's a guy playing the guitar was phenomenal. And I was just like, wow. So I remember going up to this guy and wanted to talk to him about his guitar playing, and his name was Brian Turco, and I got to know him over time. And you know, initially my thing with him is I wanted to learn how to play guitar or something. I wanted to be cool like him, you know. But you know, the more I wanted to be cool from him, the more he talked to me about Jesus. And I was getting really ticked because I was like, you know, like I'm not here to learn about Jesus, man. I want to learn how to play guitar. I want to get girls and things like this. And I remember he said, you know, if you learn to play guitar and stuff, you'll get girls. But he said, but you got to get Jesus first, because you can't just have any girl. You got to get the right girl. You got to get the girl God wants you to have and stuff. I said, dude, you're making this complicated. And I remember at one point, you know, I still had my gun, and I decided, you know what, I want to shoot him in the head. You know, and I remember being really mouthy at him, and we were taking the bus one day, and he was about 8 years older than me, so I was about 15, so he's about 23 at the time.
Yeah.
And I remember being really mouthy at him and disrespectful, and I'm like, I could shoot you. And he's like, yeah, you think you're so tough. He goes, yeah, if you shot me, I died, I'd go to heaven. I know where I'm going. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't want to do him any favors, so I'm not going to shoot him. So I'm like, okay, well, now what do I do? So I figured, look, so he agreed that he said, look, I got a bunch of friends who are musicians. I live in this house of musicians. Why don't you, behave yourself? Yeah, I'll come and I'll introduce you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I didn't realize he lived with a house full of musicians who were playing with some really big names at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Paul Jans, Skywalk, there was Derek Mason from Derek Mason All-Star Blues Band. There were like serious musicians, studio
mm-hmm.
musicians, very respected.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know they were all born-again Christians.
Wow.
Like they had started this little movement in this house. Mike Root was a drummer. He played for a band called Thor, and then he ended up playing again for Paul Jans and stuff. And I was like, and they began mentoring me.
Mm-hmm.
They began spending time with this rebellious 16-year-old kid, and I began learning songwriting, music production, music from these guys, and I began taking that back to high school.
Mm.
And I remember started meeting other musicians in school and started jamming with them, and then people began respecting me for my musical abilities.
Mm.
First time I ever got respect or acceptance.
Wow.
And next thing you know, I started creating bands with my friends. Some of my friends,
mm-hmm.
friends at church, friends
mm-hmm.
outside of church, and I got really good. I got good on guitar. Became a really decent little songwriter,
mm-hmm.
and I'm being mentored by these guys, and all of a sudden, people are like, I was getting more affirmation and acknowledgement from my musical giftings than I've ever had in my life for anything.
Wow.
And it was, of course, in school they began calling me Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah.
Because
you were a
brown guy.
Yeah.
playing the guitar. But it was a lot better than the other nickname I was being called, which was Abdul.
Oh, yeah.
And when I was in grade 8, and so forth. So I ended up, but part of the problem in our society is we don't take the giftings
mm-hmm.
of a lot of young people and allow them to flourish.
No.
And I encountered a plethora of resistance
mm-hmm.
in terms of my musical development
mm-hmm.
from the number one source, my mother.
Mm.
Why are you playing that stupid guitar?
Yeah.
She didn't mind me getting some basic lessons, but she didn't want it consuming me and things like this. And again,
the only positive activity you had in your life maybe at that point,
mm-hmm.
and she didn't catch it.
No.
Yeah.
Mind you, the church picked up on it. I began
Yeah.
getting mentored by people in church from the music.
Mm-hmm.
They gave me opportunities to play music in church. I began playing in the band with Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada. I was still growing up in the PAOC.
Mm-hmm.
And I began playing at these, I can't remember what they're called now, but we'd have like 2,000-3,000 kids show up.
Yeah.
At these, now they don't have those.
Youth conventions.
Youth conventions.
Yeah.
And my bands would play.
We still have those things going on. Yeah.
And so I would be playing at those things with my
mm-hmm. bands
and stuff. And at that time, I got into Christian music a little bit. Got shaped by Larry Norman
mm-hmm.
and Randy Stonehill and these kind of guys. Yeah. And so it was very organic. I didn't have this powerful come to Jesus kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it was a transitional thing where I just was influenced to be cool. And I remember just taking my guns one day and just throwing them into the Fraser River.
Mm-hmm.
You'd always go, it was funny, it was back and forth thing. Every Sunday evening, we'd have these Sunday evening church services. We'd go up to the altar, ask for forgiveness, and then we'd become little turds for the rest of the week.
Yep.
And there was this cycle that went on. But the influence of Brian Turco, and the funny thing, I got to say, Brian Turco, at one point, he was an incredible, first of all, he's an incredible singer, incredible guitar player.
Mm-hmm.
And he could play some other instruments as well. And he actually was opening for a very famous Canadian band in the 80s by the name of Saga, which were out of Hamilton.
Saga,
And he was going to a concert where he's going to play, and there was a blackout moment for him, and he ended up on his face on the pavement, lost consciousness or something, and I guess he had a come to Jesus experience,
mm-hmm.
and he walked away from a flourishing music career.
Mm-hmm.
And he had all the trappings of decadence and hedonism and stuff going along with that. But he gave it all to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And he just decided he wanted to become a volunteer youth worker with Vancouver Christian Life in the West End, you know. And Rob Powell became one of his mentors as his pastor and stuff. And so, but Turco lived in East Vancouver, and the church was in West Van, about 10 kilometers. Well, Brian never had any money for bus fare. The guy didn't have money to pay for socks. He would wear bare feet in his running shoes.
Yeah.
And he would jog from the East End to the West Vancouver to go to church to volunteer with us.
Wow.
Ungrateful,
He's
rebellious
dedicated.
little turds.
Yeah.
As a youth leader.
Yeah.
And then I told you how we wanted to treat him at one point. And so the heart of this guy was phenomenal. And what the difference he made was incredible.
That triggered something in you, didn't
it? It did. It just it showed me like this guy will give up his life for this kid.
Yeah.
Greater love have no man than they give up their life.
Yeah.
You know, God talking about Jesus. But here's Brian just modeling that in a practical, lived way in urban Vancouver. Right? And just, you know, and so I was like, wow, what this guy's doing for me. You know, and again, he'd jog, his feet would bleed, you know. Again, phenomenal guitar player. Later in life, you know, God blessed him and his wife. He ended up with a beautiful wife, and with a flourishing business. And Milano's Coffee, in Vancouver, and you know, and this guy who was living in poverty, trying to volunteer, trying to help street kids, but you know, along the journey, he got plagued with rheumatoid arthritis. You know, his feet suffered, his hands have suffered. It's interesting. That's a miracle that he can play still as well as he can, even with his hands subject. The same hands that he used to build Milano's, grinding the coffee beans and stuff and making them internationally successful, renowned beans. But you know, again, and we're friends this day, 35 plus years later. Yeah. You know, we had a few times where we were out of contact for a number of years, but you know, but again, it's just kind of God's plan. I remember in 2009, the city of Vancouver brought me back to lead up their drug prevention strategy and to prepare for the 2010 Winter Olympics. That's like, if that's not God's sense of humor, I don't know what is. You know, this former kid was a gun-toting drug dealer in grade 9. Now they fly you back, you know, first class, put you up in a 5-star hotel, and you're there to help launch their city's drug prevention strategy to prepare for the world for the international presence of the Olympics. You know. Yeah. But at that point, you know, Vancouver Sun came and covered a story on me. There was in grade 11 and 12, there was a high school teacher that mentored me, Fred Lepkin. I was functionally literate for most of my school years. The school gave up on me. I couldn't read, write, do anything properly in school. I wasn't that great. And the word you'd use is functionally literate. I knew the kind of rudiments. I didn't know how to work them properly. I didn't know how to make them really. So I would break all the rules. I didn't know how to the sequence of how things fit. Right. And so in grade 11. This high school teacher at Burnaby South High School, Fred Lepkin, my history teacher, or actually, he was my history teacher in grade 12. In grade 11, I joined a group called Agitprop, which stood for Agitation Propaganda, which was where we used kind of social justice themes to give positive kinds of messages to the other kids in school. So between Fred Lepkin, who, by the way, was I didn't know at the time that he was gay, but he was Jewish, atheist, obese, you know, and turned out he was gay. But, you know, just treated me with nothing but kindness and love and compassion. And he essentially taught me to read and become a student. Yeah. And he worked really hard at it with me. And again, I'm friends with him till this day. He's in his 80s now. And so here, on the one hand, I had this evangelical, born-again, former rock star Christian. And on the other hand, I had this other guy. And it just goes to show you that God can use, you know, the just and the unjust. He can use anybody.
I think, you know, about Paul says, you know, you've got 10,000 instructors, but you've got one Father. I'm your Father in the faith, you know, and I think that for a lot of us, we can look back on our school years, whether they were positive or negative, and there'll be one or two, maybe three teachers that just kind of stood out above the pack, and you knew that something was being imparted to you.
Yeah.
For me, it was my English teacher in grade 11, Mr. Alexander, and I fell in love with words.
Yeah.
You know, and I can think of some other teachers that you know weren't so kind and weren't so influential in a good way. But so at this point in 14 to 18, you're coming to Jesus. You're starting to have new positive influences in your life. Things are looking hopeful for you.
Well, I'm going to tell you one thing that happened, and again, I mean, Fred was at school, Brian was in the community. I'm going to be honest, I experienced a lot of racism at church as well.
Yeah, I believe that.
Okay. And that was tough. And so the racism was in the church, it was at school. But there was this one guy, and it's interesting. You actually remind me a lot of him. You have the same disposition, and you even kind of look like this guy. Oh. And his name was Norm Fuller. But I don't want anything bad to happen to you. But I'm gonna tell you what happened. I'm gonna tell you what happened.
Maybe I'm his evil twin.
Maybe you could. No, he was a beautiful man, and Norm. We ended up going to summer camp with the church PAOC at Western Pentecostal Bible College, and I remember waking up one night, and here's Norm praying and prophesying over me.
Wow. While you were sleeping?
While I was sleeping. Wow. And I woke up, and this was when I think I would have been about 16 or 17. I don't remember. It was around that time. It was as I was still on the, going back and forth, walking two worlds, living in two worlds. Yeah. And Norm was praying over me and prophesying over me, had similar hair to you, a similar beard, but not without the gray. And it's all brown. And he, I remember just being filled with the power of the Holy Spirit.
Wow.
And I was like, wow, this is so powerful. And I remember leaving camp that year, and I was just like, I felt like that's when I felt like so close to God. I just like, this is powerful. And
I think that's when your heart was captured.
My heart was captured.
Yeah.
But then what happened is we went back to church, and I remember just forgiving the guys at church who were still being mean to me, and and stuff. And we played floor hockey. We had a gym in our church, and we played floor hockey and stuff. And I remember Norm played the game. I don't remember if I played at that game, and that was a Sunday. It was about a week and a half after this experience and stuff. And I remember being really close to God for about maybe a couple of weeks, and then the news hit. Norm was riding his motorcycle to work in the rain, and he just had a baby with his wife. His wife, a beautiful young wife, and a beautiful little baby, and he got hit by one car, bounced off it, went flying into another car, went flying, and got run over by a third car.
Oh.
And I remember getting really angry at God.
Yeah.
So here's filled with the Holy Spirit. Yeah. And then going from that to being really angry.
Yeah.
Like, how could you have done this to this guy who you just brought into my life, who was one of the first, incredible person influence. And I remember being so broken. And it's a brokenness that kind of I've carried for the rest of my life. I mean, I understand things happen sometimes. Yeah. And remember, it goes back to the whole thing, well, maybe that's not a bad plan, You're so close to God, just take it out and you go right to heaven. So, yeah. But I saw the tragedy of his little wife and his baby, and so I remember getting that just destroying me. Yeah. And so so again, so that being said, I went to grade 11, 12, go to Burnaby Secondary School, high school, just Burnaby South Secondary School for grade 11, 12 year. Dean went there with me too. It was interesting. By grade 11. Great, I think I ended up in a Christian club because my biology teacher, biology they're supposed to teach you evolution. Yeah. My biology teacher was a Christian. Yeah. Mr. Canwisher. And then there was another teacher, Mr. Davies, and so there were these high school teachers that had this Christian club. I think I don't even know if they allow Christian clubs in high schools anymore, but they should. Yeah. Because I'll tell you, that Christian club made a huge difference for me.
Yeah.
And because if it wasn't for that those Christian clubs in the high school, I probably would have gone hardcore back into the drugs and everything else.
Yeah.
Because the temptations were that bad, and I did start hanging out with some pretty bad kids in grade 11.
So there's a transition that came around 18, 19 when...
Grade 11, yeah.
Yeah, when you ended up moving to Toronto.
Well, after high school,
Yeah.
I had all these incredible... And I was functionally literate till about grade 11.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, there was this hyper-focused kind of whatever method he used that got me to memorize. I started learning to memorize things. I didn't understand it. Mm-hmm. So when it came to math, I memorized. When it came to English, I memorized. When it came to social studies, I memorized. I didn't know how to read per se. I just memorized words. And I didn't know how to do the math. I just memorized the equations. Right. So it became and so I remember Fred Lepkin at the time saying, your memory is incredibly powerful, which was interesting because my father was renowned for his memory. Wow. My father had memorized the Oxford Dictionary. He knew every single word, and he learned it over his lifetime. So he would memorize 5 words a day.
Yeah.
And my dad used to walk around speaking this impeccable British accent, for a lot of his life,
Yeah.
And he memorized. So maybe it was something passed on. My mom had I think my mom's memory wasn't as good. But anyway, but my dad's memory was just incredible, except, the alcohol abuse kind of degenerated it over time. So yeah, and that's what that is basically what became my, the way I ended up learning was because of my ability to memorize stuff. Yeah. Not that I understood phonics or understood math, or I never understood anything. I still really don't. I just memorize stuff.
Yeah.
And so, although my memory right now is not as good anymore, but with age, but by grade 12, here was this kid who 2 years older was barely functioning. I don't know why they were passing me in school. I ended up with a kind of a B average across the board in grade 11. Really flourished in my guitar abilities. I took guitar in school and got mentored with some other kids and started playing with bands and stuff. And then by grade 11, though, I ended up finishing one of the top history scholarship students in the province of British Columbia. And I ended up getting a scholarship to go to University of British Columbia. But, unfortunately, a lot of my friends in high school, I carried on with my music.
Yeah.
I got I think what happened in first year university, I got heartbroken with a girl. Right. And so that kind of really messed up my focus. Yeah. Right. And but I also ended up with some friends from high school who were engineers. And one thing about engineers is those guys can drink and never seem to get drunk and still do amazing on their exams. If you're an art student like I was, with a focus in history, you go and you try to drink with them, and you end up waking up in the fountain of the university. So I ended up messing up my scholarship, failing out of university at UBC. I was essentially banned from any university in the country for 2 years. Because I had violated my scholarship. I had gotten, my GPA was horrible. I had to go and redeem myself. And then the way I ended up doing that would be to go to college over time and build myself back up. And I would return back to university about 8 years later. But the point is, 8 years later. So after Expo 86, came about, and my sister from Toronto, I had a half sister from Toronto, the same sister who was kidnapped at the age of 3.
Wow.
Was brought back into my mother's life 12 years later. As a teenager. Yeah. She ended up in Toronto with her father, the guy who had kidnapped her, and taken her out of the country. And she ended up in Toronto. She had actually finished the top high school student in Ontario. Wow. Graduating at the age of 16 or 17. She ended up at U of T in First University. I think she was 16 or 17. And this is when you had grade 13. So she was really smart. She was in pharmacy. But anyway, she ended up quitting and going and getting married and eloping because she wanted to be away from her father. Because again, this guy obviously was a pretty bad guy. I mean, he kidnapped his own daughter. Yeah. And so she went and married some guy, got away, married this guy who looked like the Eric Estrada from Chips, from the old TV show. And so I was really enamored with her husband because I go you look like the guy I watched on TV. Yeah. Anyway, but she came to a faith in Jesus, independent. You know, like I think my mom met her and kind of had some influence there, but there was a longer backstory. But she ended up became a born again Christian, this sister, and so she came to visit me in grade 12, and it was a grade 12 or it was no, you know when it was in after I had failed out of university or during that time. And she came and she could see my life was getting pretty reckless. I had a motorcycle. I was actively trying to kill myself. I was having I had a couple of horrific motorcycle accidents. Those are other stories that I won't get into where God literally saved my life. There's one motorcycle story where I essentially should have been killed, and it was a miracle how I survived it. But I remember getting kicked out of university and just kind of having some Joe jobs, these young people jobs you get, working at 7-Eleven, that kind of thing. And she said, she came and she goes, God's brought you this far. And you're kicking and screaming. I think you need to get away from mom. Why don't you come out to Toronto and go to Bible college? And get your life straight, because you need a fresh start. You need a reset. And so I guess I would have been about, I was still 18. And so I was I 18? I was Expo 86, so I guess 67. So basically 18, 19, 18 or 19, I think it was 19. And so I remember we went to this church where I was going to. It was the same church for one of the high school Christian teacher leaders. I started going to his church. And I remember we went up to the front and I said, okay. And I remember all my friends saying, what are you doing? Why are you leaving us? And it was mostly my secular friends. I had some Christian friends too. But they were all mad. All my friends were betrayed that I was leaving. Yeah. And I just said, I just got to do this for God. Yeah. And me. And I remember leaving and going to Toronto. My mom was upset. My friends were upset. And that started the journey. From the west to the east.
That's your Abrahamic story, eh? Leaving your home country.
Yeah, but
find something new.
Yeah, but that being said, again, God has his own plan, but those mentors, Brian to this day is still in my life. Yeah. Fred Lepkin, the teacher, he's still in my life. And Norm Fuller's still in my heart. And so and I think without those three guys along the journey, one again in the church, one again in the community, one again in the school. Yeah. And so one of the things I advocate for a lot of kids is they need to have three mentors. And it was really funny because later in life, as I got to know Mike Clark, who became a mentor for me in Toronto. He was a former Peel police officer, and then he went into youth ministry, he actually was in youth ministry, then he became a police officer, then he went back to youth ministry after he was on the force for 8 years and his partner was viciously murdered. And Mike was harshly impacted by that. But he went into youth ministry, founded the dam in worked at Evergreen Young Street Mission, founded the dam in Mississauga, then he became an ordained Anglican priest. And that was in his 60s, and we're really close. But he actually says you have to have three mentors. But he said this later. I had never really labeled it. Yeah. I experienced it. Yeah. But I went through my life kind of saying this in many public talks of the value of mentorship. Yeah. But it was really interesting. I never clued in that I had these three mentors: one spiritual, one educational, one community.
Right, and those have been three critical components of your life. Yeah. Yeah, you self-described your life as snakes and ladders. Yeah. And things that were critical to navigating through life: mentorship, education, and employment. Yeah. And the fourth one, your faith in Jesus. Yeah. It sounds like through your life, from those rocky beginnings, that you had to learn how to learn.
Well, you have to learn how to learn, and and people throw around the word resilience.
Yeah.
And I guess from an academic or a kind of a pseudoscientific or social scientific definition, the word resilience basically says an innate human characteristic of strength that allows or enables or facilitates a person to be able to overcome adversity. And what I don't like about that is even as myself as a social scientist, I don't like the fact that it makes it seem like we have some element of superhumanness within us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and as though it's just magically there. Some people are. Now, don't get me wrong. Some people, like I'll give you a concussion as an example. You can be a real big guy, like maybe like the Lindrosses, but maybe they were really prone to concussion. Like, so there's obviously some kind of genetic or biological predisposition. So some people, it's not about how big you are, it's about how much brain fluid or gel fluid you have between your brain and your skull. If you have, maybe you could be a small guy, you have more of it, so you could take more hits playing hockey and you're less vulnerable to a concussion because it's protecting you more. You could be a big guy but have less fluid between your brain and your skull, and then all of a sudden you get more access to brain. So
there's a physiological element to resilience and your ability to withstand. I guess.
We can say that.
Yeah.
But again, my point is that God creates us all.
Yeah.
So my point is, whatever it is, it's God-given.
Yeah.
To greater or lesser degrees. And God says, just like he gives faith to greater or lesser degrees to people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I believe that we all have physiological predispositions and resilience. We all have a kind of, we can have this capacity. But my point is, I believe it's God-given. It's within our genetics, it's within our biological code, but it's, it's not just something innate that's born within us and it's evolutionary, is what I'm trying to say. And so I think we need to say that aspects of resilience at the end of the day are tied back to the fact we're creations of God, and sometimes we have a little bit more, sometimes we have a little bit less, and say, well, isn't that unfair of God that he might give one person less resilience than the other person? And I think the Bible answers that. It says, God gives each person that's what they need to live their life.
Right.
If that makes sense. And then, but you say, well, what about people who aren't born with some factor or they're born disabled in some way? Well, again, the Bible answers that. It said it's so that other people can show God's love to those people. Yeah. See? So it's not, and so like who sinned? Why is this person disabled? The mother, the father, or the person? No, it's so that God's glory can be revealed.
Right.
So I honestly believe that when there's people who are suffering a detriment or who are lacking in resilience, then it's up to the Christian community, or it should be, to make intervention for those people.
Right.
Like Norm did for me and Brian did for me.
Yeah.
Right? And then God might use somebody who's outside of the faith, like to use for his purposes as well, like he did with my teacher, Fred Lepkin. So I guess this is basically, the idea isn't always about the individual, it's about the community.
Yeah.
And so we have to, so now it's interesting because, later in life, I was the primary author of the Social Determinants of Health Framework for Urban Youth, which had an uptake with then the Minister of State Public Health, Dr. Carolyn Bennett, to be used as a kind of a framework to help inform these kinds of dialogues across the country and benchmarks. And one of the things that I was shaped by as I wrote the Determinants of Health Framework with my co-investigator, Dr. Carol Stewart, who was the head of Child and Youth Work at the time at the same university where I was working. She was really influenced by a guy who actually graduated with his PhD about 2 or 3 years before me at Wilfrid Laurier, Michael Unger, who's a professor at Dalhousie, and his expertise was in resilience. But one of the things that he brought to the discussion of resilience is he said, it's not necessarily just innate. It can actually be fostered and conditioned by the environment.
Yeah. Yeah, the myth that things are hardwired into us.
Yeah.
That you actually have some adaptability and you can learn.
And you can be conditioned, And if you look at some of my resilience, maybe a lot of it may have been fostered. by just these small. And one thing we also know is interventions don't have to be big to make a difference. They can be little.
Yeah.
So it's that old
like a guy who's praying over your sleeping body.
Yeah.
And it had a profound
influence
on you.
You know, you can if you change the direction, you're leaving the port of New York to go to London, but you change your setting 1 degree to the south,
you'll end up in a completely different place.
Right.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
and you know, there's other little things. You know, an ounce of prevention is better than the pound of cure. So for me, I and again, I've had my own experiences where I've just done something innocuous, write a reference letter to get a kid into a certain program. I had one of my students who graduated from Tyndale University, for example, and I wrote a reference letter for her, you know, to go to do her professional degree in social work after. She ended up going to UBC, my old alma mater, where I got kicked out of.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of funny, you know, I got kicked out of I mean, again, God's sense of humor.
Oh, yeah.
I was kicked out of university and banned from any university in the country in 1986.
Yeah.
And by 2006, I was what is that? 20 years later, 20 years. I was featured on the front cover of Okufa magazine, which is the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations, which represents all the faculties in Ontario of like 14,000 professors. And I was named one of the top 3 professors in Ontario under the age of 40.
That's God's style, isn't it?
Yeah.
Take the least likely.
Yeah.
And say, oh, I'll use that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, and again, my mom always had this line: God has a sense of humor.
Yeah.
And so I don't take it as this sign of, you know, pride, or I just say it's like it's hilarious.
Yeah.
And so anyway, to make a long story short, I you know, my life has never been perfect, and it continues even to not be perfect till this day.
Yeah.
You know, I'm a product of God's grace. And then after I violated his grace time and time again, I encounter his mercy. And after I violate his mercy time and time again, I'm still a product of his hope for who he wants me to be, for his purpose.
You are his beloved.
And you know, it's funny you use that word, because that is the word that Michael Clark, one of my mentors today in Ontario, who's been a mentor of mine in Ontario for probably the last 30 years, he always uses, we're all God's beloved.
Yeah, yeah.
And he calls us his beloved.
Well, Anthony, I want to thank you so much for opening up your heart and letting it come out your mouth today. You say many things that give us a lot to think about when it comes to, you know, God's power to change a life, but also you know, I think for Christians who are listening to the podcast, to maybe sometimes reframe how they think towards people that others might say, oh, they're write-offs. You know, you could have been written off so many times, and yet in God's mercy and God's grace, there were people that came like Jesus to you. And also thank you for taking our producer Bill Riley and I out for dinner last night.
Oh, it was good food.
That was good Lebanese.
Good Lebanese at all.
Yeah.
But you know, and the last thing, one thing I wanted to say is, when it comes to faith in Jesus, and I heard this from a kid I worked with a long time ago, and this kid was wise beyond his years. He said, whatever we go through and experience in life, no matter how difficult or hard, the old adage, you know, of course, God can take bad and turn it for good for his purpose. But our past doesn't have to predict our future.
That's it.
And one of the things we do in clinical is we're always looking at a person's past behavior, because we want to be able to predict their future. That is a deterministic, social scientific curse. Because it makes no provision for what the transformative power of God in a person's life.
Right.
And so when we look at, well, you know, whatever that person, and again, you see it with police, where they say, once a thief, always a thief.
Right.
But you know, I'm a firm believer that a person's past doesn't have to predict their future.
No.
But I think the caveat to that is it's even more powerful when God's involved, because at the end of the day, I'm a doctor of psychosocial clinical practice. I treat anxiety, depression, trauma, all this kind of stuff. Now I work with as a university professor. We can give intervention, but only Jesus can provide transformation.
Yeah.
From the inside out. And so our past need not predict our future.
Our past has this tremendous gravity upon us to pull us down.
Yeah.
But the transcendent God that we follow in Jesus has this anti-gravity effect to actually lift us, cause us to rise.
Yeah.
And well, thank you so much for being with us today. And I feel like we're scratching the surface. We're going to have you back for another episode one of these days.
As long as we can go out for Lebanese food before.
You got it. And maybe next time you come down to Windsor and it'll be our treat.
Yeah. So. God bless you. Thanks,
God bless
Peter.
you. Thank you, Tony.
You are His beloved. That's a message that can change a gangbanger into a change maker. One thing that we can learn from people like Tony is that young men and women who are caught up in gang activity are not always hopeless cases doomed to fail. Unfortunately, for many of them, violence and incarceration will be on the path ahead. That's why we're doing this series of Gangland Preachers. We need to see how we can engage in change in our urban centers. On our next episode, we're going to interview E.J. Tupe. E.J. and his family live in downtown Toronto, where he connects with young men and women caught up in cycles of homelessness, addiction, and crime. He is, in my estimation, a tour guide to hope, leading people one by one to a better place in life. And that episode drops on June 1st. And believe me when I tell you, E.J. Tupe has a story to tell. He has many stories to tell. And until then, keep one ear to the sky and another ear to the ground in your city. I'm Kevin Rogers, and this is Sidewalk Skyline Podcast.